In this video, we are going to be discussing 3 exploits to help you crush live poker tournaments. Live poker tournaments are absolutely booming right now, and I fully understand that it is no fun to consistently make almost deep runs, but to never actually win. It is frustrating, and I want to be sure that you, hello, I see you there. I want to be sure that you have an excellent shot of winning every single tournament you enter. In order to run deep and actually win, exploits are the way to make it happen. And in this webinar, you are going to learn 3 major exploits that I recommend you add to your strategy immediately. The first is going to be my number 1 exploit for pre-flop play. Next, continuation betting exploits of various types. And finally, one gigantic exploit on the river to make sure that you stop going home early. Let's get right to pre-flop ranges. Number 1, you should exploit wide pre-flop ranges, and you, perhaps, should make a point to try to cultivate a very loose, battly image. I definitely recommend you play pretty crazily, pretty wildly from the button, and even more wildly when you're facing a button raise. This is because whenever everyone folds to you on the button, you're in position and against only 2 random hands in the blinds. And if your opponents are competent, loose, and aggressive, they realize the same thing when it folds them on the button, which should result in you getting after it. Whenever the button raises, you should 3-bet them relentlessly. Almost no one 3-bets often enough. And a big benefit of raising a little bit crazy on the button and fighting kind of crazy when the button raises is that you are going to get paid off when you make a good hand. Not just in these scenarios where you're battling hard against the button or from the button, but also when you are in early position. I do not recommend you change your early position and middle position ranges at all. Just play good, solid GTO poker. But from late position and against late position raises, especially the button, I definitely recommend getting after it. Let's take a look at this range right here. This is an 80 big blind button raise first in range. I want you to ask yourself, honestly, do you raise this range? Every single hand in this range is profitable to play, assuming you play well after the flop, and assuming your opponents play perfectly from the blinds. Just to be perfectly clear, this is when everyone folds to you on the button. If somebody raises before you, this is not the chart for you. We have plenty of other charts for those scenarios at pokercoaching.com. This is when everyone folds around to you. These are the hands that you should be playing. Notice, you should be raising pretty junky hands like King 5 offsuit, 10-7 offsuit, 7-4 suited, 10-2 suited, 4-3 suited. These are all going to be profitable to play. And the exploit here is that I recommend you actually raise even wider than this range recommends, because most players in the blinds do not 3-bet adequately. You can add essentially any hand on the cusp of this playable range. I think that's all going to be fine. Yes, you're going to be raising with a range that is too wide from a GTO point of view, but that is fine if your opponents are not going to take advantage of it. And the way that they should take advantage of it is by 3-betting a ton. Let's take a look at a small blind 3-betting range. That's this chart here. 80 big blinds deep against the button raise. The hands in red are the hands that should be 3-bet. Ask yourself, honestly, do you 3-bet the 9-7 suited most of the time, the 9-8 suited every time, the 6-5 suited sometimes, the King 5 suited sometimes, the Jack 10 offsuit sometimes, the Ace 10 offsuit every time? Most people do not. Most people in the small blind 3-bet something like 9s or better for value, Ace 10 suited and better, Ace Jack offsuit and better, King Queen, maybe King Jack, and that's about it. They do not 3-bet very many of these weak suited aces. Definitely no King X suiteds, and a lot of these junky suited connectors also do not get 3-bet. I realize it feels a little bit scary to 3-bet with a hand like 9-7 suited, because you realize you can easily call and see a flop and not get 4-bet off your hand. But you have to realize most players on the button aren't just going to 4-bet you every single time you open. And to be fair, in GTO world, they should not. They should be calling a lot. And you have to realize that if your opponent's raising too wide from the button, or they just won't defend well against a small blind 3-bet, you should be 3-betting all these hands in red, and perhaps even more. Really, if you want to take all these hands that have any red in them, any 3-betting, and 3-bet them, that's going to be very, very beneficial for you. because your opponents are going to fold too often. And when they do call, they're usually just going to fold too often on the flop. I do want to make it clear. You want to use kind of big 3-bet sizes from the small blind. What a lot of people do wrong is, let's say it folds around to the button and they raise to 2.5 big blinds. In the small blind, a lot of players make it 7 big blinds. And that would be a mistake, because you're going to get called, or 4-bet, almost every time, because your opponent's getting amazing odds in position, closing the action. Instead, when they make it 2.5, you want to make it something like 10. You want to apply a lot of pressure to them so that they're not getting great odds, and that's going to result in you having a lot of pre-flop fold equity, which is excellent. Plus, you're going to have a lot of post-flop fold equity just in general, because your opponents are going to misassess your range, and they're going to think that it is way stronger than it actually is. When your opponents think you're playing ranges that you're not, that's usually going to work out well for you. This concept also applies from the big blind, by the way. The big blind should be 3-betting more than the recommended GTO range as well, because, again, most players raise the button too wide, and then they do not defend well against 3-bets, because, to be fair, most people are not accustomed to facing 3-bets from the blinds, because most players in the blinds only 3-bet the nuts, and, well, if they only 3-bet the nuts, your life is easy. So, this exploit is to raise wider from the button, and to 3-bet wider against button raises. Exploit number 2 is to continuation bet small and often against wide ranges. You want to force your opponents to fight hard against you by giving them good odds when you continuation bet, which means you want to bet frequently and small, because almost no opponents will fight hard enough. Also, by increasing your aggression in general, by putting out lots of bets, you are helping your image, so that whenever you do actually get a good hand, you're going to be a little bit more likely to get paid off. Let's take a look at a few examples. Here we have 7-4 suited in the small blind. Folds around us, 40 big blinds deep. We raise it up. You may say, should we just limp this hand every time? Limping is fine if your opponents are going to play very, very well. But if your opponents are going to fold a little bit too often, you want to apply aggression and maximize your fold equity. Notice we're not raising to 2,000 to 2 big blinds, not even to 3 big blinds. We're going a little bit more than 3 big blinds. If you told me you wanted to go even bigger, like 3.5, I think it's fine. Pre-flop fold equity and fold equity on all betting rounds is valuable. All right, we do raise, big blind calls. King 5-5. What do you think? What do you think? Take a second. Write what you would do in the comment section down below. Play along. We have a lot of quizzes like this at pokercoaching.com. If you like having quizzes and testing yourself and improving your skills, check it out. This is a spot where I think you want to bet every time using a small size. Yeah, we're going to run into some kings and 5s sometimes, but most of the time the opponent's going to have nothing. This is also a pretty good hand to bluff with, because it has lots of backdoor, straight, and flush draws, which you'll sometimes make. And even if you don't make it, you'll turn one of those draws on the turn, which will give you pretty good equity to continue betting. Notice, we are betting 2,000 into the 6,900 chip pot. You may say, well, my opponent's going to call that every time. Okay, so what does that mean? If they're going to call the flop bet every time, because they are getting good odds in position, well, we know that we are going to need to be continuing to barrel the turn and quite possibly the river. You may say, but doesn't that risk losing a lot of chips? Yeah, and that's okay. You got to realize you're putting your opponent in a spot where they're also risking losing a lot of chips, and most players are not going to find hero calls for all their chips in situations like this, because you have to remember it's very, very easy for the small blind to have a king or a 5, which will obviously want to bet the flop and bet the turn and blast the river. So we bet, opponent calls. Turns at 3. It's a beautiful card for us. We have a gut shot. If we turned literally no equity, it's probably fine to check and then just get out of the way. But when you get any sort of draw at all on the turn, a very strong exploit is to just keep betting. Because, yeah, you're going to be running into the king or 5 sometimes, but quite often you are not. Pot's about 11,000. We're going to use a medium-sized bet at this point. We want to try to get stuff like any hand worse than ace-high to fold. I don't think anyone's going to fold a pair, any pair at this point. I don't think anyone's going to fold any draw at this point. So keeping that in mind, you already know what we're going to do on the river, right? We bet 7, the opponent calls. A nice thing about this spot is if the opponent does have a 5 or a king, a lot of players are going to rip it in right here, because they don't want to get outdrawn by the random diamond draws or the random straight draws, which is not good logic, because if we have a random straight draw or a random diamond draw, we're not going to get there very often. And we're going to feel very inclined to bluff the river, which the opponent could easily gobble up with a king and a 5. But a lot of players, especially in small stakes games, will raise right here immediately, which is great, because if you think about what that does to their calling range, it makes their calling range far weaker because it's going to not contain any kings and 5s, or way fewer kings and 5s. And as their range is not protected very well, their calling range, I mean, that's going to allow us to drastically overbluff the river. River's a 9 of spades, complete blank. Kind of a bummer. That's okay. Not a bummer for us. We're going to put all of our money in. So many players blunder this spot by betting 10,000 into the 25,000 chip pot. That would be a mistake. Your opponent's going to call with any sort of pair. But whenever you put them all in, some players will even find a nitty fold with a king. Now, if you can get your opponents to fold out a king, obviously this is a huge success. I don't think we're going to get people to fold out a king. But if you can get them to fold out a king, you're going to absolutely smash them. And if you can get them to fold out pairs, you're also going to smash them. This is a spot where the opponent's going to have a lot of busted draws and a decent chunk of ace highs, and they're going to fold a large chunk of the time. We're going to win the pot. And again, I know this feels a little bit risky. This may be out of your comfort zone. Sometimes when you run this bluff, you are going to run into top pair or into trips. And that is okay. You're going to win this pot way more often than you should on every single betting round, because most players are not going to defend often enough. Let's take a look at another one. 6-5 suited on the button. We raise. Big blind calls. Flop comes. Ace. 8. 3. Opponent checks. How much should we bet? With our 6 high. Backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. Well, the answer is tiny. This is a spot where we want to just put in a little bit of money. And if the opponent has nothing on this board, they're going to be kind of inclined to fold. I mean, put yourself in your opponent's shoes with Jack 10, Queen Jack, 9 7. All these hands are just in an annoying spot because they could be against an ace. And if you're against an ace, you're drawing thin. So this is an excellent spot to use a tiny bet. Pot was 5,500. We're going to go 1,500. You may say, isn't my opponent going to call every time? No, they're not on this board because they can easily be against an ace. Because remember, we're going to raise every single ace from the button. And remember, they're going to 3-bet some of their aces from the big blind. So we have a lot of aces proportionally in our range compared to our opponent in this scenario. Also, this hand is particularly great to bet because, kind of like the previous hand, we have all sorts of backdoor straight and flush draws, and we can continue barreling no problem on a whole lot of those. This time the opponent just lets it go, and we move on with our life. So that's exploit number 2. Continuation bet, small and often. I realize the GTO strategy does involve a lot of frequent and small continuation betting, especially when you have a bit of a range advantage. But quite often the GTO strategy does a lot of checking when you do not have the range advantage or the nut advantage. And in these scenarios, exploitatively, if your opponents are not going to call often enough or raise often enough against small bets, you can bet frequently and small, and you're going to crush most opponents. Exploit number 3 is to stop hero calling on the river. The goal in poker is to make the most money that you can. The goal is not to be right or to let people know that you got outdrawn or even to play perfect GTO frequencies on the river. In small stakes, live poker tournaments especially, people are simply not bluffing often enough. So, if your opponent is not bluffing often enough, what should you do on the river when they want to put in a lot of money? Well, the exploit is to never hero call on the river in spots where you don't beat any value hands. If you don't beat any value hands, and you think they're not bluffing often enough, you just have to fold. It's annoying. I hate folding. Against people who bluff a ton, you should not fold very often at all. You should drastically overcall. But I'm telling you, in most small stakes tournaments, people simply do not bluff often enough on the river. Therefore, you should drastically overfold when they bet the river. Let's take a look at a few examples. Under the gun +1 raises, 50 big blinds deep. We call king 10 of spades in the big blind. In a $1,100 live tournament, flop comes king, queen, 5, 2 hearts, no spades. We check, opponent bets small, we obviously call. Turns to jack of spades. Not a great card for us, even though we do pick up a straight draw, because now we lose to queen jack, pocket jacks, ace 10, and 10-9. All of which the opponent could have. Plus, we were already losing to a whole lot of hands, too. Opponent bets 6,000. We cannot fold right now with top pair into straight draw. We call. River's a 4 of spades. We check. Opponent bets pot. 20,000 into 21,500. What should we do? Well, a lot of people who are trying to live in GTO world just call every time. They think, oh, top pair, what can you do? But absolutely not. This is a spot where we have, in my mind, a trivially easy fold against a player who is not insane. If your opponent's playing reasonable, normal poker, and especially if they're on the tight side, and they're on the not so inclined to load their money into the pot without a good hand side, that should make you very, very inclined to fold in this spot. Now, this is about the best hand I am going to fold. I'm not going to fold Queen Jack here, for example, or King 5 if I happen to have it. 2 pair is probably good enough because the opponent could be value betting Ace King. I wouldn't be shocked to see Ace King. But even then, bad 2 pair is not loving this scenario at all. Because you have to realize the opponent's not going to be bluffing. If you give them random Ace X, are they just going to run a triple barrel bluff? Probably not. And also, they have a ton of nuts in their range. Don't forget, the opponent logically has a whole lot of premium hands. Literally every single premium hand that's available, the opponent could logically have in their range. And when they can have all the value hands, and their range doesn't even contain that many logical bluffs to begin with, you just have to find big, big folds. And right here, this is a spot where King 10's an easy fold. We let it go. But I'm telling you, I see players all the time find calls here thinking, well, I have top pair, I have a blocker to the straight, I got a call. Then their opponent shows them pocket queens or queen jack or ace 10. I'm like, oh, so unlucky, so unlucky. Not unlucky, just a bad call. Let's take a look at another one. Pocket nines. We raise it up. 40 big blinds deep in the low jack seat. Big blind calls. Flop comes 8-6-3. What could go wrong here? Opponent checks. We're going to continuation bet using a rather big size because here the board is very dynamic, meaning hands that are currently very good right now on the flop are somewhat likely to not be very good by the river. Anytime there's a flush draw and or a straight draw, but no flush or straight available already, those times you usually want to be betting using a large size. If the board was instead 8-6-5, where there's a straight already available, in that scenario, we want to be using smaller sizes in general. Or if there were 3 spades already on the flop, we want to be using small sizes in general because there's a flush already there. Anyway, this is a spot where we're going to want to be betting big, especially with our hands that are almost always good but vulnerable, and the lowest overpair to the board almost always wants to bet big. Also, top pair, top kicker almost always wants to bet big on dynamic boards. That would be pocket nines, maybe pocket tens, ace 8, king 8. These hands want to go big on 8-6-3. Opponent calls. Turns a queen of hearts. Opponent checks. So here, I think we could go either way between checking or betting. Again, the problem is on this very dynamic board, we certainly do want to err towards betting using a large size. But if we use a large size, given we only have 34K left and the pot's 13,500, we're starting to get close to being all in, which is certainly not ideal. If we bet the turn and get jammed, it's miserably bad. And when you start using medium or large sizes on the turn, I do think we are going to start to get jammed some portion of the time with the opponent's draws. So that's not great. Let's just check it back. Try to get to a cheap showdown. River's a 2 of spades. Flush comes in. Some straights come in. Opponent bets 12,000 into 13,500. This is one of these spots where in GTO world, it's just a call. It's an annoying spot, but it's just a call. We do block some flushes with the 9 of spades. However, we do block a lot of logical bluffs too, with 10-9 and 9-7 and 9-5 suited. So this is a spot where if we were trying to call at reasonable frequencies, you just got to call here. But you have to ask yourself, do we beat any value bets? What would value bet in the spot that we beat? Would ace 8 value bet or 10-8 value bet? Probably not. Not when the spade comes. So we're logically not beating any value bets. Next, will the opponent bluff in this scenario? Too often. If they do have a hand, like 9-7 or 7-5, will they bluff it every time? A lot of players don't because they're worried about us having the flush or a queen that's just going to call. So if the opponent's not going to be bluffing often enough, and we lose to every single value bet, we should fold, which is what we do. This is a spot where, look, I have a tough time folding. In the previous hand with King 10, that's just an easy fold. Hopefully everyone knows top pair in that spot's an easy fold. I think this one's way closer to a call because there are a lot of busted draws, and we do have the 9 of spades, which does block some value hands. That said, most players in most small stakes $1,000 buy-in tournaments, I realize $1,000 may not be small to some people, but it's not a gigantic high stakes tournament against players who bluff at adequate frequencies. In this spot, you should probably just fold. And we do fold. And when we fold here, you got to realize we don't know if we folded out the best hand. Some players hate that. They hate the idea of not knowing if they made a good fold or a good call. They want to know definitively, and they're willing to pay for it with their tournament life, or at least a lot of their chips. Don't be that player. Realize that most players in most small stakes games do not bluff often enough, especially for large amounts of chips. And the way you exploit someone who doesn't bluff often enough is to drastically overfold. So do it. Be willing to make the play that results in you winning the most money possible. So that's it. 3 exploits to help you crush live tournaments. And when I say crush, I don't mean sneak in the money and cash a little bit more often. I mean win the tournament more often. First, exploit wide preflop ranges. Open the button wider. That's going to let you play probably a few hands more profitably, which lets you win more money. Also, you want to 3-bet against wide ranges relentlessly, which will result in your opponents overfolding either preflop or on the flop or on the turn or on the river. And you're going to pick up lots of pots that don't belong to you, which is going to let you get off to a very good start in the tournaments. Next, continuation bet small and often because people aren't fighting hard enough. If people will not fight hard enough, meaning they're just overfolding on all betting rounds, put them in spots that are terrible for them by using frequent and small bets because most people do not continue often enough, which is again going to result in a lot of small and medium pots being pushed in your direction. And finally, stop hero calling on the river. You got to get rid of your ego or the need to know that you made the right play. I'm telling you right here, every good player in the world will also tell you, most players in most small stakes games do not bluff nearly often enough on the river, so your exploit is to fold, 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 fold. You may say, but if I fold every time, won't I be easy to play against? Yes, you will be. If your opponents decide to start blasting off their stack every time on the river. But they won't do that. No one does that. No one is trying to bluff all of their money off way too often in gigantic pots. They just don't do it. Now, obviously, I want to make everything clear here. If you are playing against someone who plays very differently than the typical small stakes player, say you are playing against someone who likes to 4-bet every single time they get 3-bet, well, don't 3-bet them so wide. 3-bet more for value, right? If you're playing against someone who seems to always bet the river and they play loose ranges on all betting rounds, well, now you need to start calling those players. But these are general tips that are going to result in you drastically exploiting the small stakes player pool, which is what we're going for. You still have to use your brain, you still have to think, you still have to exploit your specific opponents, but these 3 tips will help you massively exploit the opponents in small stakes games. So get out there, do it, let me know how it goes. Come back to this video, let me know in the comment section below how it goes. Sometimes you'll win, sometimes you'll lose, there's variance, but on average, these tips will result in lots of chips being added to your stack. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. If you have a friend who's a little bit too weak and tight before the flop, or a bit too much of a calling station on the river, send them this video. They'll be eternally grateful. Thanks for being here. Run hot, and I'll talk to you next time.